Conservative. Constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
Today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, with the aftermath of the Trump verdict, I'll let you know the real reason why I'm frustrated with many Republican politicians on what they're saying after the fact and how that relates to Russell Coleman, Attorney General of Kentucky. What should he really be doing? What should the Kentucky Attorney's General response be to this? As well as what did he say? Which also brings up the question, what has Russell Coleman been doing since getting into office as Attorney General? Well, we'll answer that question. Kentucky Right to Life has had an interesting legislative session, and their behavior in the primaries leads some to question about whether the Republican establishment and leadership is trying to get away from a 100% pro-life stance by fading out how much they support right to life issues. And then finally, Fayette County Public Schools puts out an interesting budget that includes cutting art classes while providing new benefits to employees, including a wellness coach to their superintendent. Makes you wonder what their priorities actually are. Well, we know it ain't the students. We'll have all that and more today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Before I dig into it, yesterday I really focused on the significant inflation issue that Kentucky is having compared to all the other states around it. That it isn't just that Kentucky is experiencing the same inflation issues that all other states around us are experiencing, but that actually Kentucky is experiencing a greater inflation rates. And I was pointing out how that deals with some policies within the state that make goods go up in cost. I thought that was pretty straightforward. I thought that was pretty easy to understand, but yet there were some that decided to try to take issue with it. Now, if you want to go back and hear me actually talk about that exact stats and what's all going into that, head on over to theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's theandrewshow.com. Hit the Listen Now tab, and you can check out old episodes there. But so I posted on Twitter just some top-line stats I touched on very quickly in yesterday's show, that Kentucky has the highest inflation rate out of any state that touches it. According to Moody's Analytics, the average 3-month inflation rates in Kentucky was 3.4%, while Ohio has experienced 2.8%, West Virginia 3.13%, Illinois 2.98%, Indiana 2.55%, Virginia 2.66%, Tennessee 3.1%, and Missouri 3.02%. And the responses I got on this were just frankly fascinating, and it shows too where we are, not just as a state, but also too where the leftists a lot of times are, right? Here's an example that somebody made a comment of, not saying necessarily a leftist, but I'm entitled to believe so, and that was the Bluegrass lady, 3.4%, what a great country we live in. And then another individual went ahead and made a comment that, oh, well, you know, this is great. Inflation seems to have moderated. Inflation is getting down lower. Biden's doing such a great job. And instead of, and claims times are good and Kentuckians are enjoying it. That's what they said. And what's so odd here is in the post I made, I added on to the fact, so I listed out the rates there, and then I said, I wonder if the fact that Kentucky is experiencing more inflation than surrounding states has anything to do with the fact that our Republican, in quotes there, leadership decided to pass a bill in 2022 that created new sales tax categories and business-to-business services, raising the cost of goods for consumers. When it comes to money, this Republican majority is certainly not conservative. What's funny here is if you pay any attention to state politics, what a well-informed Democrat, which I guess that doesn't exist, so maybe that's why none came in to say this. So if I was arguing for the Democrats on this, I would have read this and said, and this is why Bashir was against it. It raises the cost for the working people. Income tax only saves money for the rich, and yada, yada, yada. You know, obviously the pushback against that is that clearly if you think a Republican is bad when it comes to taxation and spending policies, just wait till you see a Democrat's policy, right? For the Republicans, the fact that they tax too much and spend too much, it's a bug. They're not supposed to. They at least pretend that they're not doing it, right? They at least honor the fact and understand that they're not supposed to be doing it. But when it's a Democrat, that's actually a feature. You know, the fact that they can't handle their money, that is a reason apparently to vote for them. But so that would have been the smart thing to do. But instead of taking the win, they say, oh, you know what? We're going to say, oh, inflation's so moderate, inflation's so down. And it's all built around this idea that our inflation rate needs to be 2%. And inflation is theft. Understand this, right? If you made $100 5 years ago and you put it on your dresser, in 5 years, it's worth less. So somebody's come along, if instead of $100 you put out 100 singles, somebody's come along and taken money from that 100. So you had 100 singles, and now you have maybe 90 singles or 88 singles. Somebody's stolen $12 from you. And you say, what happened to it? You say, Andrew, that's just inflation, though. That isn't something government can control. You're wrong. Government is the only reason we have inflation. Understand this, okay? The reason why our Fed, the Federal Reserve, attempts to get to a 2% inflation rate is because they believe you need a 2% inflation rate to grease the wheels of the economy. Because if inflation was actually zero, if people weren't worried about their $100 losing value, their thought process is that people then want to invest in businesses. They want to put money into the stock market. That wouldn't fund new regulation, new growth. People wouldn't be moving their money around, okay? Understand there's two parts of kind of the money supply, right? It's not just how many dollars you have, but how many times has those dollars changed hands? See, this is what economists are looking at a lot of times. How fast is money moving? And the idea here is the faster money moves, the faster your economy grows. And so they attempt to have a 2% inflation rate because it's not so crushing to your everyday American where they're getting destroyed, but at the same time, it stops you from just laying your $100 on the top of your dresser. But if you follow any kind of economics, and particularly Austrian economics, Ludwig von Mises, if you read anything he has to say or many of the other Mises-type economic people, you'll understand that inflation is only caused by the government. You know, you'll have, booms and busts, inflation, quote unquote, within individual products, you know, like for an example, wheat may go up in price because there was a bad weather season. That's not caused by the government, and that may have a trickle-down effect. Gas may go up in price because of something happened, but then that will have a trickle-down effect. But eventually, over time, that should come back down. It should trickle back down to where it was at, because then you have good weather one year and everything else. And if you look at all these things over the length of time, it should be 0%. What causes inflation is when you have a money supply that is not tied to anything and you can increase it. If you can keep your money supply at the same level, well, then you don't see inflation. But if you can increase your money supply, well, now you start to see inflation. So this idea that inflation being, even if it is, wow, it's only 3.4%, that should be something to celebrate. It should be zero. It's our government playing with our monetary supply to steal from the citizens, But that wasn't and as crazy as it sounds, that people celebrating the idea that this is a quote unquote a win because inflation rate in their opinion is low, so low. That wasn't actually the stupidest thing somebody had to say. No. There's actually some pretty dumb other things said, including people putting forward a pretty crazy conspiracy on some cabal coming together in Kentucky to decide to raise the prices because of profit or something. I don't know. We'll go over some of their other arguments back just real quick after this short break, and then we'll go into Attorney General Coleman, how he responded to the Trump indictment, as well as just some other things that we want to hit on when it comes to Coleman. But we'll have all that after this short break. If you want to reach out to the show, make sure you email info@theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's info@theandrewshow.com. We'll be back in a few short minutes. And you're back on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. For the break, I was going over how yesterday I talked about inflation, and I posted about online, and I got some comments back about a post where I was talking about how Kentucky has very high regional inflation. And one of the comments that we got from a more moderate Republican was possibly a factor. So I blamed the inflation on the fact that the Republican leadership decided to put in a bill that caused new sales tax categories in business-to-business services. And of course, businesses, and this is a key economic idea that apparently can't get through the thick skulls of the leadership, or rather, it does. They completely are aware, Republican establishment in leadership are completely aware of what's going on here, they just don't care. And so they're either have really thick, dumb skulls, or they really hate the people of Kentucky. Pick your poison, but either way, it doesn't look good. Because you cannot increase, businesses don't pay taxes. Okay, businesses aren't people. As much as the government has ruled in times that businesses are people, businesses aren't people, okay? They don't pay taxes. People pay taxes. And so when a business has to pay a tax, it means it's either A, coming out of the profit line, which then comes out of the pocket of those who own it, or B, it's getting passed on to the consumer through higher prices. And when it's a tax, it's going to get passed on to the consumer in higher prices. A lot of these businesses are built upon profit margins. They have a certain amount that they can spend on marketing or things like that. And if now they're getting charged a sales tax on marketing, which they are, well, then that would cause a cacophony of issues down the line, which causes an increased price to the consumer. And so this person said that maybe possibly increasing the cost of doing business in the state, the consumer's products, maybe affected it, but of course it's more complicated because income tax drop might mean people are spending more. How much did these states extend high unemployment benefits? Example, keeping more cash in the system. That's an interesting claim to make because while Kentucky's cost of doing business can be greatly affected by the regulations of the state, things like the money supply in the state, relatively speaking, the state government doesn't have too much control over. Obviously, when businesses come in, they make jobs, everything else, you'll see individual regional inflations. Don't get me wrong, because the demand for something like housing, for an example, in a certain area, like where they're building that Ford plant, the demand for housing goes up, so therefore rent goes up in price. That happens, right? But that's not going to happen all across Kentucky per se. While some areas are winning, some areas have people moving out, and so their rent's going to go lower, okay? But also, too, the money supply into Kentucky, like the cost of milk, okay? Dairy isn't a big industry in Kentucky. While we have some dairy cows, many of these dairy products you're drinking off the shelf at Kroger, for an example, are not coming from Kentucky. So how do people having more money cause Kentucky's milk prices to go up 36%, over the last 4 years when the national level of prices going up has been like 26%, 24%, somewhere in there? Over 10% more Kentucky's milk prices have gone up than it has nationally over the last 4 years. That's not due to keeping more cash in the keeping more cash in the system. That doesn't make sense. That money existed already at the state level. Now, when you're talking at the national level, they can actually print money. You see, that's the big difference. When you're like, well, if the federal government keeps more cash in the system, though, that does cause inflation. Well, the federal government can print money. They can borrow money. Okay, the state government can issue some bonds, don't get me wrong, but really our state has a balanced budget amendment, and the vast, vast majority of its money is either going to come from the federal government or right out of your pocket. Not a lot of it is going to come from debt sources. All right, now here's one more, okay? One more person commented and said, Republicans sigh, and tweeted back at me, turns out a lot of the inflation was price gouging. Retailers saw there was some real but temporary inflation and used it as an excuse to jack up prices even further. Now they're all cutting prices, first Target and Michael's, now Walgreens. What this person's saying, whether they realize it or not, okay, is that they believe that some cabal of retailers has come together, decided to increase Kentucky's inflation rate and prices in Kentucky by a higher percentage than the rest of the area surrounding us. And notice too, they're mentioning retailers, Target, Michael's, Walgreens. They have no control of their cost of goods. They have no control over the inputs. Okay, items coming in cost more, so they went ahead and increased their prices. The inputs cost more. They work on a percentage basis. They went up more. Pointing out retailers as somehow being the cost of inflation. Now, if you want to say to the suppliers somehow if you're going to make this argument, and I don't agree with you regardless, but if you're going to make the argument, you would then start at the suppliers, not the retailers. They are on the marketplace of competing, right? I mean, if take meat for an example, all right? There's only 4 major meat processors in the nation. In the nation, 4 major meat processors. USDA inspected, can sell to the supermarkets. So yeah, they're not in as much competition. But how many different places can you go and buy, I don't know, milk? If you can go to Target, you can go to Walgreens, you can go to Walmart, you can go to Kroger. You've got all these places to buy milk. You, the consumer, are not limited to who you can go see to see milk. So retailers like Target, Michael's, and Walgreens, they're not the ones causing inflation because of their price gouging. They're on an open marketplace where you can walk with your dollars. And unless they all come together as a cabal and have a secret meeting, which I guess is the conspiracy they're saying, where a group of retailers came together and just say, you know what, we're going to jack up these prices. You know who we're going to hit real hard? Kentucky. We're going to hit Kentucky real hard. Absolutely, 100% patently ridiculous, but those are the kind of arguments we can expect from those on the left. Let's see here. At the end of yesterday's show, I did talk about the Trump statement, talked about Whitney Westerfield talking about the Trump indictment. And I talked about Andy Barr's statement, but I want to go over Russell Coleman's made a tweet on Trump, and here he goes. He says, "It's politics, not the law. Behind New York's prosecution of President Trump, the American people want to focus on the issues that matter and will render their own verdict on November 5th. And what prompted me to kind of talk about this again is that I kind of, I don't want to say went off, but I kind of a little bit went off today when I was talking to people, not on them, but just out of sheer frustration on all these politicians with their empty words, okay? And I'm kind of upset a little bit at people too as well. The idea of weaponizing government against their political opponents is not new, okay? May I remind you, I still can't get an alcohol license in Kentucky due to me standing up to Bashir against COVID. Need I remind you that Kelsey Rock, who ran against Michael Meredith down in Bowling Green area in Edmondson and Warren counties there, that he came under attack for being 2 weeks late on child support, something unheard of, something that any family attorney you talk to would say, this is unheard of for somebody to be prosecuted for being 2 weeks late on child support, that then paid it too, before they got involved. Like they paid it before anything was filed against them. So just for being 2 weeks late, but having paid it, was drug into court on election day. And who is the county attorney that is in charge of child support enforcement in his county? Well, Michael Meredith, the guy he is running against, wife. You know, and do I need to point out Eastern Kentucky? I mean, I know people who've had to move out of counties in Eastern Kentucky because somebody in the family had the temerity to run against the sheriff or run for judge executive or run for magistrate or something, and now was just so harassed by the law and the police and everything else in that town that they felt ran out of it. And this is my frustration. Okay, if you're really mad about President Trump, this isn't new. You just are noticing because it's such a public and obvious example that everybody pays attention to. But families have been being destroyed by federal, state, and local government corruption and targeting for a very, very long time. This isn't new. And what's worse for those people is they're not billionaires. They don't have a cadre of people to donate $200 million to them over the course of 4 days. They're left out in the cold on their own while everybody else has been sitting on their hands, and then it happens to Trump, and now everybody's upset about it. It's been going on for a while. And I know a lot of you hearing this are like, look, I didn't know this has been going on. I'm unaware of these situations, and that's okay. And I challenge you to listen to the show. That was something, obviously some of the people I was talking to said, look, I wasn't aware of these things. I would have stood up and fought on it. And that's where the media isn't going to cover it like they're going to cover Trump, and I get that. But if Russell Coleman really wanted to stand up and say what's being done to Trump is wrong, this is what he should be saying. He shouldn't be making some empty statement about how Trump's going to win in November and that will exonerate him and this is an unfair verdict. If Russell Coleman says, I see what's happening with Trump and it's wrong, so instead of empty words, I'm going to commit myself and my office, because this is Russell Coleman's job, that if anybody in the state of Kentucky is misusing their position of government to go after their political rivals, I will bring swift and severe justice on those that deserve it. I will not tolerate corruption from politicians weaponizing government against their political enemies. Everybody deserves to be treated fairly under the same rule of law by this government, held to the same standard regardless. I'm not going to hand out special treatment, but I'm also not going to treat people extremely harsh because of their political stance and their political actions. He could stand up there and say that and say, you know what? This has been going on with Trump, but it's happening here in Kentucky. You know, I'm going to commit somebody specifically to hunting this out. I'm going to create a specific department, a specific person. This is now the most important issue to us because this has made it clear that if we want to be confident in our government and confident in our legal system again, there has to be justice at all levels. People have to believe that they can be treated fairly. And as long as this corruption is allowed to continue, we'll be in trouble. But of course, he didn't say that. Didn't say that. Empty words. But it's not all bad for Coleman. He has been doing some pretty active things. We'll be going over that after this short break. And you're back on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. So before the break, I did a little rant on what I wanted Russell Coleman to say in response to Donald Trump's verdict, and it involves ensuring that that kind of corruption doesn't happen here in Kentucky. That'd be great. But instead, he hasn't been doing that, but he has been doing something pretty solid. He has been fighting back on a lot of Biden's EPA issues. And if you follow Coleman at all online on Twitter, you'll know that he's taking on these EPA things very hard. He's leading the way kind of nationwide on EPA issues. In fact, he was on Fox back in April talking about what he's taking a stand on and how he's kind of leading the way, 25 states fighting against these EPA mandates. Let's take a listen to what he had to say on Fox and Friends back in April.
Well, the Biden administration's EPA issuing their biggest crackdown on gas-powered cars to date. Our next guest is leading a coalition of 25 states to block the rule. They say it'll sacrifice the American auto industry to the radical green agenda. Kentucky Attorney General Russell Coleman joins us now. Good morning, Russell. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning, Nicole. Good morning from the Bluegrass State.
So I've heard you say that this new EPA restrictions will actually take American jobs, move them overseas to countries that actually have poor emissions rules than we do here. What are you doing to combat this, and how do you think it'll hurt Americans?
I tell you, Nicole, it's a lot like President Reagan's comment to Carter. There they go again, and again, and again, and again with this administration. It is yet another iteration of a radical green policy, a radical green agenda where the emperor ultimately has no clothes. I'm speaking to you from Kentucky. You think bourbon and horse racing, you think the Kentucky Derby, you don't think of 58,000 automobile jobs here in the Commonwealth alone. Throughout the Southeast now, we have become a region of auto jobs, and those jobs will be driven not only out of our Commonwealth, but will be driven out of our country through this radical agenda, through this new tailpipe policy. I'm sitting in a state that has 1% of the market is EV, 1% of the market here. But yet the Biden administration is, through these regulations, are seeking by 2030. And I went to law school to avoid math. I won't wear you out with statistics. But the reality is this regulatory scheme envisions a 50% increase, that 50% rather of the market will be electric vehicle by 2030. 70% of the market, 70% of the market in a decade. Look in a state that has 1% of the market. These will shut down. These will calcify and shut down the market in terms of folks' ability to buy gas-powered vehicles. We love our trucks here in the Commonwealth. We love our F-150s. We produce F-250s here. That market will no longer be present. To folks sipping their coffee this morning, this is not someone just beating the podium. This is very real and threatening to your ability to buy a gas-powered vehicle.
Now, what's interesting, just a quick comment I wanted to make. During that video, they threw up a map of the states that are involved in the lawsuit, and a deep red state, Tennessee, was actually missing from the list. Now, why would Tennessee be missing from the list, but Kentucky isn't? Well, Tennessee has a big, you think our Ford battery plant's a big deal. They have an entire blue oval city getting built in Tennessee in order to push EV vehicles. And so obviously the financial incentive for Tennessee, if EV vehicles grow, they actually would gain more auto manufacturing jobs potentially than what they currently have. They do have some factories currently in Tennessee. I know the Nissan Titan, I do believe, is made in Tennessee, as well as a few other factories in Tennessee. So I know they do have vehicle manufacturing already, but where they're getting not just the battery plant, which is all Kentucky's getting, keep that in mind, the battery plant, they're actually getting the electric vehicle manufacturing hub for Ford's EV plant in Tennessee. And so they didn't join in on the list because they're pushing it. But then that leads to another question. You know, if Coleman here, he's looking at this and he's saying, you know, we have Toyota, we have Ford F-250s being manufactured here. Down in Bowling Green, we have the Corvette factory, right? These are not exactly the F-250 Corvettes. Well, Toyotas could go electric, and they could adopt their lines to it here in Kentucky. But the point being is that gas is obviously far and away our largest thing, and the potential for us picking up more electric vehicle plants is possibly there with that electric vehicle battery plant going on in Kentucky. But the point overall remains, and that is that it's not exactly super great for Kentucky's economy. While Tennessee might be making a little bit different of a balancing act there. But see, if it was based upon a policy, right, it would be nice to think, though. So as much as ups as I give to Coleman for protecting Kentucky's automobile economy and industry, as much as I like that, I do have to ask the question of what is really motivating this? Because I would like to hear in the language things like this is, you know, playing in the marketplace, artificially raising the cost of goods and services on the everyday consumer is wrong. The government should not be meddling in free markets this way. I'm a Republican. The Republican Party platform makes it clear that we believe the government doesn't create economic opportunities but can only hinder them. And when the market's ready to make a shift to electric vehicle, the market will make that shift. But pricing Americans out of their cars and pricing them out of their lifestyles simply to push this radical green agenda is reprehensible and done by a government that hates its people. I love for him to hit upon the platform, hit upon some economic ideas, but instead he's just talking about, of course, what it'll do to auto manufacturing, but also the green agenda by Biden. And he's hit him on some other things like soot rules. And as such, well, that deals a lot with energy production. And I'd love to think Coleman's doing it out of the kindness of his heart, but that's not really why politicians do what they do, especially not Coleman. I mean, let's be honest here. Russell Coleman, without having a real opponent, like at all, like he didn't have an opponent. Pamela Stevenson, not an opponent. He didn't have a primary. So he didn't have a primary. And then Pamela Stevenson barely put up a fight. Meanwhile, Russell Coleman raised over $1.1 million. $1.1 million. And that doesn't happen because somebody is just super principled. You raise $1.1 million without even having an opponent because people know you will give them considerations for giving them money. That's why it happens. As I always say, when these people are not donors, they're investors, and they're looking for a payoff, and this is the way they get paid off through government action. Sometimes it aligns with us, and that's great. But the scary part is what happens when their viewpoints and their motivations don't align with what's good for the people at all. And when we look at Russell Coleman's donors, we see things like Duke Energy, we see LG&E, we see coal, we see many other energy people in the energy industry, coal industry, and this is why they gave him money. They wanted somebody that was going to be strong on this issue, that had some juice to him, and he does because he comes from McConnell's camp. And so they said, this is the guy that will stand up there and fight for our corporate concerns. So that's why we'll give him all this money and help him get elected. As I said, it's great that it aligns with us, but what happens when it doesn't do that? Coming up after this, we'll hit upon Kentucky Right to Life, making some interesting moves where they're breaking a little bit with leadership and had some interesting outcomes on bills last year that they were involved with. How that points to is the Kentucky establishment, is the Republican establishment here, shying away from being 100% pro-life. Is Kentucky Right to Life feeling it? And they're starting to break a little bit more with leadership, or Is it just simply a whole lot of smoke but no fire? It's just simply, they're going to continue to endorse, as long as their bills move forward in the future, they'll endorse exactly what the establishment tells them to endorse. We'll have that discussion after this short break. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. Oh, and I realize some of you, for the first time, are just now tuning into the Andrew Cooperrider Show, so I want to encourage you, go ahead and reach out to the show. Email info@theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's info@theandrewshow.com with your show ideas, your tips, your thoughts, if you're just trying to reach me. Some of you have been messaging my Facebook and reaching out to me through other means. And while I appreciate you reaching out through those means, I'm not as organized and I don't necessarily respond to you as well as I do if you email info@theandrewshow.com. So please reach out there. We'll be back in a few short minutes. And you're back with the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. Now, longtime listeners of the show know that Kentucky Right to Life, I appreciate the work they do a lot of times, but a lot of the calls they make, decisions they make when it comes to some of their policies, who they endorse, can be pretty infuriating to me at times. And a chunk of it has to do with, one, I don't know, and this is a really long discussion I've talked about before on the show. I don't think they fully have gamed out what they were doing. What happens is that they started in a state where there were abortions going on. Clearly, I mean, a lot of states had abortions going on, right? And their main purpose was sidewalk ministry. And the mindset of sidewalk ministry is not the same mindset as necessarily as somebody making policy. Because when you're doing sidewalk ministry, you are doing anything you can to save that child that mother's taking in to be murdered. And you're not going to save that child by sitting there and telling the mother that she needs to pay for the consequences of her actions. She has to raise this child, that if she didn't want to have a kid, she should have, maybe thought about that before she decided to engage in the acts that end up in children without taking precautions, or at least without, thinking through these are the expected ramifications of your decisions. So you should think about that before you make decisions, and you don't get to just murder somebody. Well, that argument works when you're talking one-on-one with somebody who's about to walk in and get an abortion. That is not what they want to hear. What's going to work is to say you're a victim. You're a victim of the industry. You're a victim of being taken advantage of by these people or those people. You think going in here is your only option because you've been lied to, and making a person feel like they are the victim. And by going in there and getting that abortion, they are fulfilling what their victimizers want them to do. And there is truth to that. Don't get me wrong. There is truth to that. That's certainly persuasive in stopping a woman from killing her unborn child. 100%. That translates over into some policies that start to look a lot like maybe some more liberal communistic type policies when you get away from abortion and what they kind of advocate for. But yeah, if you want to hear me talk more about that, just email me info@theandrewshow.com and I'll go into more detail on that specific thing. But one thing that as an organization now, like I said, appreciate the Right to Life work, appreciate the sidewalk ministry. Their policy at times lacks the courage of conviction, as I said, and a lot of times kind of is sending the opposite message of what I would want to send. But when it comes to how they handle themselves politically, they've been kind of infuriating to me, but yet running their organization probably the exact same way I would run it at the same time, okay? So this is the problem. When you're an issues-based organization, when you're focused on one issue and one issue only, all right? And your goal is to get your issues passed and handled. You endorse and you support the people based upon that one issue. So, while a person could be not pro-gun, they could be super socialistic when it comes to spending, they could be just awful when it comes to school choice, they could be awful in all these other categories, but at the end of the day, to a Right to Life group, if they have always voted yes on pro-life bills, have always sponsored pro-life bills, have never sponsored or put forward anti-pro-life bills. If they've never done anything like that, then they would get the endorsement from Kentucky Right to Life. And it just so happens, anybody who goes out here and uses and knocks doors and does anything in politics, they know firsthand that, that pro-life, being endorsed by pro-life groups is incredibly important to winning that election. And especially if you want to take down an incumbent too, that could be incredibly important. But if they can claim they're pro-life, because you knock on most doors and all they care about is guns, babies, and Trump has been a thing recently, obviously. Trump, immigration to a degree they'll talk about, but guns and babies is a very top of the line issue. Like, if you're not pro-life and you're not pro-gun, you're never getting the vote in the Republican primaries, period. It's never, ever happening. And so being endorsed by Right to Life helps. And so kind of the trade-off has been is that the establishment can get these endorsements for Right to Life by running their bills and kind of, they've slow walked them at times, but by running their bills and doing kind of what they want them to do on Right to Life issues, well, then they turn around and endorse the people that the establishment wants them to endorse in order to run cover for all their other bad votes. So as long as you vote good on Right to Life issues, you could be a no good, downright dirty socialist, but you'd still get the endorsement from Right to Life, and that helps you keep in office. And as I said, as an activist, it's very infuriating that a group that's seen as such an authority on such an important cause in the Republican side of things doesn't consider anything else and doesn't consider the fact that they're sometimes endorsing some of the politically most awful people, worst people that are literally leading to not just destruction of the state, but of the country. But they're pro-life. And so that's all they care about. So that's infuriating. At the same time, if I was running Right to Life Kentucky, that's kind of exactly how I'd run it too. Because I'm an issues-based organization. People donate money to me to get Right to Life issues done. And whatever I need to do to get them done, that is my job at that point. So while it's frustrating, I also understand it. Hopefully that makes sense. Here's my point though. Recently, some of the endorsements coming out of Right to Life has been kind of interesting. For an example, Senate District 1, they endorsed Len Beckler instead of Jason Howe, the incumbent. That's interesting. And Senate District 7, they endorsed Aaron Reed and Adrian Southworth, but Al Gallerin, who was the establishment's pick for that primary, they didn't endorse. Very interesting. In Senate District 11, Steve Rawlings, who the establishment doesn't like, versus Dwayne Forlicker, they endorsed Steve Rawlings. Interesting decision. In Senate District 29, they endorsed Randy Thompson instead of endorsing Johnny Turner, who was the incumbent for Senate District 29. In the House, they endorsed Kelsey Rock, despite Michael Meredith having a 100% pro-life voting record. But he didn't respond to the survey, but they endorsed Kelsey Rock. Michael Meredith is a big member of the establishment. In House District 45, they recommended Thomas Jefferson, but did not recommend or endorse Killian Timoney. And every single quote-unquote Liberty Republican race, Right to Life endorsed the incumbent who was running endorsed the incumbent versus the person who was supported by the establishment. Interesting. In House District 64, they recommended Karen Campbell and endorsed Kim Mosier, but they could have just left it blank, but they didn't do that. In House District 66, TJ Roberts versus Ed Massey. They endorsed TJ Roberts, did not endorse Ed Massey, who the establishment clearly wanted to get it done. So they're endorsing non-incumbents. I mean, in 91, they endorsed Bill Wesley, didn't endorse or recommend Darrell Billings, and didn't even say why. They just said, no, we're not going to do that. He even responded to the survey. And they said, nope, not going to do that. He was heavily pushed by the establishment. And that leads to some questions. Are they breaking free of this ploy to just endorse whoever the quote-unquote establishment leadership wants them to endorse? And this could be in large part due to the backlash when it came to two key pieces of their legislation that failed this last year. They tried to put forward that Baby Olivia video. That was a video, 3-minute video, that shows the development of a child in the womb in 3D computer-generated images. And they wanted that to pass, to be required to be taught so people understand, of course, the life cycle, the development of a fetus in the womb of a child. Because once you see it, the chances you're going to abort what you've seen now in person and realize that is a human being goes way, way down. Goes way down. And then they also had a few other, they had another piece of legislation to get counseling for mothers, for insurance to cover counseling for mothers who've been told that their child has a low chance of living and they need to receive an abortion because of now, quote unquote, medically necessary, and for insurance to now cover second opinions and to find out more information about that, because there's a lot of these situations where they say, oh, you shouldn't have this child. They're going to have a lot of medical issues, don't have them. People have the children anyways, and they're perfectly fine. And so those kinds of discussions. So two pieces of legislation they want to push forward failed, didn't make it over the finish line. And then you see these moves when it comes to endorsements, and you wonder if this is a warning shot to the establishment. You either pass our bills, because this has been the arrangement. You pass our bills, we endorse your cruddy people otherwise, but at least they're pro-life in their voting record, and we'll hold them to account. So it could be a shot across the bow, telling them to get in line, or could be that Kentucky Right to Life has decided, hey, we're going to have more courage of the convictions, and if so, I'm here for it. I'm here for it. I'm very excited to see that. Well, y'all, that's what we have time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. I knew I'd talk about Fayette County Public Schools budgets. You'll have to wait till tomorrow now for that. You're listening to the Andrew Cooperrider Show, your source for Kentucky politics. We'll see you back here tomorrow. Have a great rest of your day.